Welcome to the Shadow Warrior podcast. This is episode 104 and it's titled Urgently Needed a Roadmap and Regulation in India for Generative AI. It's a great pleasure for me to once again welcome Dr. Abhishek Puri to this channel where we had previously talked about our essay in Open about how AI and allopathy are complementary or similar in some sense because they're both stochastic and not deterministic, i.e., they're statistical. And the second essay that we wrote recently in June 2003 is the one that we want to discuss today, where we're looking at some of the significant issues that we ourselves found when we wrote this previous essay and had generative AI look at it. So let me move on to the next slide here. Um, First thing that I wanted to re-emphasize is that ChatGPT has taken the world by storm, and this is pretty obvious to anybody who has paid attention to the technical world. It's extremely popular. 100 million users started using it within a couple of months. And in this slide, you see how that far outstrips the pace at which every other technology in the recent past has been adopted to consumers. So this is something extraordinary. It's something that's really hit the nerve. It's hit the spot, and people are really jumping on it. Now, the question is that good, bad, or indifferent? And the answer is we don't know yet. But the problem that we are facing or likely to face is that people, since they don't realize that generative AI can screw up in all kinds of ways, they will impose and repose their faith in it. So that's the basic problem that we're concerned about, in addition to the various concerns that people have talked about losing jobs, people losing jobs and so forth. But so this is a major success. Okay, so moving on to the next slide. There is a little bit I wanted to say about what stochastic versus deterministic means and what correlation versus causation means. Very simple. If two things happen together, that's only correlation. A and B happen together does not mean A caused B. Okay, that is a big problem where we tend to assume, every time Abhishek and I, let's say, go out to dinner, it rains. So that's correlation. But I could then make a causation up and say, it's Abhishek's fault. Every time we go out to dinner, it rains, so he caused it, which is obviously absurd. But that's the problem with confusing causation and correlation, right? Do you agree with me? Do you cause rain every time you go out to dinner, Abhishek?
I would agree if you pay the bill each time.
whatever whatever I say is okay with you, right? But the end result of this confusion is that deterministic system is one where you can always get the same answer. And I just gave a little example here. If you ask generative AI, Chat GPT or Bard or something, what 2 plus 2 is, it'll tell you 4, most of the time. But there might be that one occasion in which it says 42 or 72 or something because it is
Yes.
statistical. Okay, and that is a problem. Unfortunately, we tend to believe that when it says 72, it is still correct because of the previous 999 times it gave the correct answer. And this can lead to the big problem of AI hallucinations and things like that, where absolute nonsense comes out of the chat GPT or the Bard or any other chatbot. So this is the problem in a nutshell. But there is actually a lot more. So let me just move on to the next slide. So Abhishek, you wanna take this forward? This slide?
I just wanted to add to the previous slide is that if you are ending up relying on these critical issues, let's say for healthcare, so it could generate entirely hallucinated outcome, and
Right.
we would just assume it. The other issue is that, I mean, assume it to be the truth as the seminary of truth. The other
Right.
issue is that it is tending to anthropomorphize. That means it has a human-like behavior. So both ChatGPT, Bard, or whatever LLM is going to come out, they are tending to make it as if it is a human thing which is typing it. So it is adding more credibility, supposedly more credibility to whatever the belief outcome is. Uh,
Right, right. You're right. It's very easy to get caught up in thinking there is a human at the other end, right? And it's a
yes,
trustworthy human because we've all read about how, I don't know, it's 500 billion parameters or something, whatever that means, right? So you tend to, I absolutely agree with you. The credibility of these things is high, especially because they are so charming, as you said. They can write poetry for you, and their answers in many cases are right as well as quite comprehensive. In fact, I've gotten to a point where, I instead of using the old Google search, I'm using Google Bard much of the time because the answers seem more comprehensive and better. But I don't know when it's going to give me a completely wrong answer. That's the hallucination part that you were talking about. Okay, so moving on. You wanna take a stab at this?
yeah, we had written about that how do the generative AIs work. Basically, they tend to mimic the neural models. That is, they tend to mimic the human brain, which the computer scientists call as the neural network. But as Professor Rajiv has been very clearly mentioning, that they use probabilistic models to generate words sequentially, which can make some kind of a grammatical sense, but not necessarily always the right thing. And each of them is trained on a body of work that has been scraped from the internet. So we don't know whether the copyright issues are addressed over there or not. And as a result of scraping the whole thing, they require extensive human input to make them right. In fact, just before the ChatGPT was formally announced, there were reports that few of the outsourced firms had hired workers who had suffered immense mental harms trying to figure this out. So
Right.
moving to the next, yeah.
Yeah.
So please go on, sir.
Yeah. No, I was just going to say that the issue of how much human intervention is necessary is something that we tend not to be aware of. We think the computer is so smart that it's figured it out, and therefore, we can. And we generally tend to have this impression of computers as omniscient. They must be right. But as you correctly pointed out, there is a significant amount of human interaction. In fact, that's also supposed to be a new and upcoming area, which is prompt engineering. How do you write prompts to these chatbots that will give you better answers?
Yes,
So the human element is actually not gone, and it's quite opaque. We don't actually know what has been done during the training activity. There's very little information out there because I think it's treated as intellectual property by by these companies such as OpenAI and Google and so on. Okay, so let's step back a minute and ask about epistemology. Now, this is really the key here because we're we're studying. What we're trying to do is we're trying to figure out how we learn and how we study and how knowledge is generated. That's what epistemology is. Now the issue is that knowledge may not be actually truthful, and one of the things that's quite disheartening is that a lot of Indian knowledge, Indic knowledge that we know and we can demonstrate is Indic, has been uh, has been basically captured, digested. Rajiv Malhotra has this terrific term, digested. So they've taken it and repackaged it, and they often sell it back to us as their invention. And this is one of the things that I'm scared about in terms of, say, yoga. Soon you'll find that yoga is being packaged and sent to us as an American or Western invention. So they also have this problem of the usage of these mechanisms where, for example, Wikipedia or something, there was the best example, where you've got all this material that's created on Wikipedia, which may or may not be done by neutral people. And in fact, there are a number of instances where we can point to people with bad intent editing Wikipedia articles and writing stuff that is patently untrue. But from the point of view of these generative AIs, when they're trained on Wikipedia or other large sets of data or text, they tend to believe that everything that they have, as you know, I mean, the computer doesn't know what it's talking about. It doesn't have any idea of the context. So what it sees as correct, okay, and then it feeds to us as correct, may be completely inaccurate, biased, etc. So that's what's called data poisoning, where people are actively uh, messing with and creating biases in data. So that's something that we need to be worried about in addition to the AI hallucinations. And just one last point there. See, Abhishek was talking about how it produces these generative AIs produce things that are um, grammatically correct. So that means they're syntactically correct, but they're not necessarily semantically correct. Their content may not be accurate. Moving on. Take that, Abhishek.
Yeah, so we were talking about that how the linguistic models, we have also written that how the linguistic models were incorporated. We had a discussion today morning on Sanskrit as being the immutable language, whereas all the other non-Latin languages like English, which have borrowed very heavily from other languages like Latin. So much so that English did not even have a working dictionary till about 500 years back. And it required a huge dump of almost, I think, 1,000 Latin words to make it even more useful. Unlike Sanskrit, which is completely immutable, Professor Rajiv has worked extensively on linguistics, and he has mentioned very clearly on the Panini's grammatical syntax. That is how, that is, I mean, for over thousands and thousands of years, everything has stayed intact. Now, generative AI is mostly trained on the English language, which means that it is going to be utterly useless for, let's say, Spanish or German, or even for that matter, Hindi, or any of the other 23 officially recognized languages, or, the thousands of dialects that we end up speaking here. So, same for the same reason, like the Western healthcare indices that are routinely applied on rest of the world. We had mentioned about the example of body mass index, which may be more relevant to the Western population compared to the index subset, where the body fat percentage is anyway higher. And similarly, the definition of hypertension or the cutoff values for diabetes or any number of examples. Um, Despite the claims of ChatGPT's, superhuman efforts, it cannot speak two languages clearly. For example, I can switch very easily in any of the regional languages of my mother tongue while I am talking in English, and also understand the language nuances. So the generative AI is primarily very dull, very without any emotion. It cannot convey the linguistic nuances. I think we can move on to the next slide in case you have anything else to add, sir.
Yeah, I just wanted to point out that the linguistic part that we talked about is the fact that Paninian grammar is context free in the sense that if you write a sentence in Paninian grammar, it has exactly one meaning, which is not true of natural languages. They are ambiguous. And this whole idea of context free grammars, I think with a fair amount of confidence, one can suggest it's the single greatest invention of a human mind in history. And I'm not just saying that myself. I believe, people such as Noam Chomsky, who is not exactly a big friend of India, have said similar things, that this is an incredible invention. This has not happened in any other field. For example, in physics, they tried to come up with a grand unified theory of physics, and they failed. Even somebody who is always considered the epitome of genius, that's Albert Einstein, was not able to come up with a uh, theory that satisfies all observed data. But here is Panini, 2,500 years ago, who did exactly that. And, uh, and it was rediscovered in a way by IBM computer scientists in the 1950s when they tried to create new languages that computers could use because computers cannot deal with ambiguity. And so they came up with a notation, and lo and behold, it turns out that their notation for these precise languages is very similar to what Panini had done. And so, therefore, there is a very interesting connection between the semantics of Paninian languages and the syntax of such languages. So let's not go too much further into it. I just wanted to give a little bit more than what Abhishek was talking about. So the next point, let me take this up, Abhishek. See, I'm
Yes.
rather concerned about intellectual property rights. I was, for example, a member of the committee that wrote the first intellectual property policy in India in 2016. It's there, and we've been a little disappointed in how well it's been, or not so well it's been implemented. But intellectual property is something that we need to take very seriously because the rest of the world has cavalierly, used our IPR, and we have stood by sort of helplessly. And it's come time that we got to put our foot down and say, look, you can't take our intellectual property and run with it. And you see this all the time. I mentioned yoga, but the other day there's this gentleman named Huberman at Stanford. So he came up with this idea of I forgot something uh, systematic sighing or something he called it, which turns out to be pranayama. Okay, so he's now trying to rebrand it, just like Harvard people have rebranded meditation as mindfulness, right? So, and then they sell it back to us. So this is something we should be worried about. And generative AI, and there was an interesting recent development. Japan has declared that any text that is used for training in AI, it loses its copyright. That is a radical point or radical decision, which means that something that is the livelihood of lots of people. For example, the Harry Potter works. That's J.K. Rowling, this lady named J.K. Rowling. It's her intellectual property, but according to the Japanese ruling, it can be used by anybody, and there is no copyright. So this is something that's quite worrying. And it's not just copyright, it could be patents, right? Anything that is in currently in intellectual property may disappear. So this is a significant issue. Okay, so let's move on to the next slide. And you want to take this up, Abhishek?
Yeah, I'll just quickly mention I am not a legal expert, but we had raised a couple of issues. So when I was reading the ChatGPT blog, I found that Iceland had made strategic investments. Icelandic is a very unique language, again, with its own set of nuances. But those guys were smart because they realized that the generative AI should include the Icelandic language and it could be ignored at the expense of the other dominant language, which is English. Why we cannot do it, it's an open question. Why we should do it, again, it's an open question. As to what possibly generative AI could, generate in terms of returns on investment. I mean, it is okay that we have a very fancy technological issue that has cropped up or innovation has been done. But if I were to choose between generative AI or any other form of AI, I would give little less relevance to generative AI because it has the potential to upset a lot of things. What is important is that India has still not openly set up in the data protection bill, which is still lagging. I hope that we have the localization very clear as well as the legal nuances clearly defined. The next question that we raised in the article in the Open magazine was that whether the state patronage could define the arts like it was done in the Vedic times or the pre-Vedic times. I would like to quote Dr. Ankit Shah, who has spoken very extensively about the Mandir ecosystem and whether the Mandirs, whether the Mandirs could, sponsor the musicians, sponsor the writers, authors, people who create literature. And last but not the least is that how China is coming up. We would be taking the geopolitical aspect in the next few slides, but how China is basically denying the access to most of the big tech, what we call as the coronary steal phenomenon in the cardiology. That is, it is stealing the blood flow at the expense of already underperfused area, which means that it is denying the access to its major market while plundering or stripping to the bone the other technology that is being brought out by either the big tech or being funded by the Western taxpayers. So I would conclude my bit of the story here. So in case you could add
Yeah,
anything else.
let me add a little perspective to this, which is that you mentioned the Mandir ecosystem in Vedic times. No, it's not Vedic times alone. I mean, it's like 100 years ago, 200 years ago, we had, for example, Guruvayur is this major temple in Kerala, and you had several great poets. For example, there was a gentleman named Puntanam Nambudiri. So he wrote what was one of the biggest, most dearly loved Malayalam epic hymns to Lord Mahavishnu there. And, like that, there were many scholars who were nurtured by temples and also by kings, in kings' courts. So, which is an interesting mechanism, and it's a good contrast with the Western mechanism of giving people these private rights, which, for example, a patent is something that you can hold for, say, 20 years, and you have a monopoly on that. But at the end of that, it goes into the public domain. Whereas the Indian system was that it was created in the public domain. In fact, very often you had the creators not even signing their works because it was meant for the public's consumption. So the American, I should say, the Western concept of intellectual property is one where you profit from what you've created or invented, whereas the Indian idea was that it's meant for the public good. And maybe if the copyrights and patent protections disappear, like in the Japanese case that we mentioned, then we need to go back to this mechanism where the state or the temple actually supports people who are doing the invention, innovation, creation, etc. So it's an interesting thought. I don't know if we can quickly jump into it, especially because one of the issues that we're facing in India is the companies which are sort of the quasi state today, they're not supporting R&D to the same extent in India as in other countries. So there are some concerns about whether, in the absence of incentives, in the absence of sponsorship, people will just simply stop creating. That is a concern. Okay, so this is a bigger issue than what we can handle here ourselves, but I think it's something to think about and worry about. So let me move on to the next slide, the geopolitical ramifications. And please take this forward, Abhishek.
So, like I had mentioned in the previous slide, there is a mad rush to, generate LLM models. The US is claiming that it has created around 40. Chinese have jumped on the ship claiming that they have created around 20 or 30. And these claims can be made by anyone. I mean, there is no open audit as to say that each of the model is different from the other one. So basically, you can just tune a bit of parameters and call that algo by a different name, and then claim that the output is superior to anything else that the humankind has ever seen. So, what is the ultimate, optimal outcome? Whether those models or LLMs are actually in production, whether they are contributing to the industrial output, manufacturing output, or the economic activity. Unless we have clear answers to that, then the claims can just sound as claims. Very surprisingly, Middle East has also jumped into the fray, where UAE announced what it calls as Falcon 40. I mean, for want of a better word, because Falcon is very prominent there. And I had mentioned in my slide that a spouting oil well can finance a lot of things. So those guys are very lucky to have the crude oil just floating everywhere. India has made a limited public announcement, like we mentioned over here, Chiranjeevi from IIT Bombay, India Bird from IIT Delhi, Kalam from IIT Madras. So, I'm not delved deeper into what the capabilities of India's LLMs are, but as we mentioned in the previous slides, that it requires creation of India-specific data sets basically to avoid poisoning. And I would dare say add that we should have LLMs based on domain specific niche areas with all the language nuances intact so that the not only the language is preserved, but the idea and the outcome is also preserved. So would you like to add anything else to it?
Yeah, I just wanted to mention, for example, that the term LLM, we didn't define it. It's a large language model.
Yes.
That's the technical term for what underlies these generative AIs. And I wanted to correct something you said about China having announced about 20 LLMs. Their latest count is 79. Okay, but
Oh,
then we know Chinese are prone to exaggeration now and then. Um, I got a call which I have to decline. Okay, and then the other thing here is we need to have these, as you pointed out, these uh, models maybe in different domains. Domains that are specific domains where there is significant Indian knowledge. But the fact is that we can't sit by and if we don't if we don't play, if we're not players in this, I think we're going to be left behind rather quickly. And there is, that's the sad part or the scary part, but there is hope. And that's what we want to talk about in this next slide. When I have spoken to AI experts in the past, maybe even as recently as 2022, what they told me is that we can't do a whole lot here because it requires an enormous amount of money for the hardware. And it's typically, for interesting reasons, NVIDIA chips, NVIDIA's graphics processing units. And you may need tens of thousands of them, which themselves will cost over $100 million. And we don't have that capability, which is a big problem for us, apart from the issue of the content, the databases. See, we don't have any text databases in Sanskrit. Absolutely none. I doubt if we have many in Hindi or Malayalam or any such language. And this is something we need to fairly urgently do in a couple of strategic ways. One is that if we don't capture these knowledge bases, they will be digested sooner or later. They'll be translated into English and they'll be gone. The second is that if we do manage to collect this in our own and keep it in India. This is a problem with the data protection as well. Today we don't have a strong data protection bill, and anybody can take Indian data, for example, medical data, and take it outside. So this text data, which we had ignored all these years, may in fact be even more valuable than human data about medical or other parameters. Okay, so the other aspect of it is that a lot of this text data in India is crumbling. Okay, it's in old manuscripts which nobody can read now because there are too few people who can read the older Sanskrit versions, not even Panini and even earlier. So our heritage is kind of disappearing right in front of our eyes. So that is a concern that we need to address. And um, so it's twofold. One is the cost of the hardware, and the other is the fact that we haven't put in enough effort to create these large sets. And by default, everything is in English. So now, if we can look at what's happened in the recent past, there is a ray of hope, which is that, see, we had all been under the impression that only these very large companies, such as Google and Microsoft, OpenAI is basically a Microsoft arm right now for all practical purposes. These guys have plenty of money, and they're able to create these data sets that contain 500 billion parameters. So, when Abhishek was talking about Falcon 40, Falcon has only 40 billion parameters. Okay, whereas if you look at ChatGPT, it's got a trillion parameters. ChatGPT 4 or GPT-4, right? So we were under the impression that you needed, and it not only costs money, it costs an enormous amount of time. It took, I think, a year to train GPT-3, and I don't know how long it took to train GPT-4, and Bard we don't know. So it's time and money. Now, what happened is an absolute bombshell of an announcement came out from Google, where it said, "We have no moat, and neither does OpenAI." Now, this is fantastic news for us. What it's saying is something counterintuitive, which is that a very large data set is not necessary to get the same level of output, good or bad, as the big guys. Okay, that is to say, even if you only have, say, 13 billion parameters, and I use that number because that's what Meta's LLaMA or YAMA, LLaMA, that they open source, that has only 13 billion parameters. And people were able to take this and make, I think it was at Stanford, they made a new version called Vicuna, and they made another version called Alpaca. And it took them only like a couple of weeks to do this. And it cost not millions, only hundreds of dollars. And they came out with these models, which are out there available for academic use. And it turns out that the output from them is not that bad compared to the output from Google Bard and OpenAI. Now, this is revolutionary. What it's saying is that instead of spending enormous amounts of money, okay, and assuming that there is this emergent intelligence from having more and more data in the data sets, we can go with a small data set. And in fact, some people have now started putting these tiny LLMs out there. One guy actually put an LLM, based on this open source from open source Llama from Meta. He put it on a Pixel phone, okay, and another guy put it on a laptop. Now this is great news. So we are no longer constrained by hardware, okay. So we can now concentrate on the real thing, which is the data set. Our data sets that are an intellectual property treasure for us, okay. So that is, this is something that happened only in the last couple of weeks or maybe a month. So this is great news for us, which means in effect we can have 1,000 LLMs in India. You can run it on. You don't need to run it on a laptop. You can run it on a small server or something, and still maintain a level of accuracy. Accuracy, of course, within quotes, because we already talked about hallucinations and poisoning and so forth. That is comparable. We say it may be, according to this next slide that I'm going to show you, it's, Vicuna and Alpaca are 92, 93% comparable to the output from ChatGPT, which is sort of the benchmark here. And as I mentioned a minute ago, it took relatively little effort to do that. So this is a huge deal, and this is something that sort of changes the playing field. It levels the playing field, and we need to jump on it. And so the assumptions about we don't have the hardware, I think, fall by the wayside. It's not the hardware that's important. It is the ability to create the appropriate data sets and maybe create them in very narrow domains. Maybe create a data set that's only for diabetic patients, for instance, okay, or create one for a certain legal area, okay, or for, I don't know, machine tools, or I don't know. I'm just giving out several examples of narrow domains where we can benefit from Indic knowledge. Yeah, Abhishek, you want to add something to that?
Yeah, when this paper from Google stating that there is no more, when it came out, I must admit that I had completely missed it. I just glanced it over. But then there was some other blog post which was referencing to it, and it was then I realized the enormity of the development because Facebook had open source practically it's the the algorithmic tools. ChatGPT has not really come out with what kind of data sets it is including, how it is running the algorithms, how it is training everything, and it's practically opaque and they stopped even sharing they even stopped the papers. There was a lot of snafu when Google had fired one of his so-called ethical researchers and then went full of org. But what is surprising is that when we were researching this article, it was when we were doing the initial brainstorming, it just struck me that the Facebook's stock it was trading at about 150 USD. It suddenly went up with the announcement of the open source model, or rather the open sourcing of its LLaMA, and which means that the investors could see that this is where the ecosystems are going to form, and they rewarded immensely to Facebook. The same has been done for Falcon 40B. It has been done for Bard, or they are planning to do it for Bard. They are making rapid announcements for the enterprises to come in. So I think the it is boiling down and distilling down to the fight between the platforms. Whoever can make the better ecosystem, who can retain the users and push their own version of hardware, own version of fine-tuned chips to run the algorithms, and that will have a cascading effect on the economy of the cloud computing as well. So it's a very interesting scenario as to who wins the battle of the platforms. So if I have to distill and make it very simple for everybody, this is the answer to it.
Right, right. So what that what that means really is that, see, open source often wins. This is what we have seen in other areas like operating systems. Basically, that once you put something out there and the developer community jumps on it, they are able to take it forward. There is also this evocative paper called The Cathedral and the Bazaar, where these big companies are cathedrals, which are structured, and you have, cardinals and popes and all these hierarchical things. And then you have these bazaars that are rather, chaotic, but the bazaars actually turn out to do a terrific job in quickly bringing the technology up to speed. And so that's potentially going to happen. And Meta, which has open sourced its code, may still benefit from it. And in fact, it may end up being the leader as compared to OpenAI and Google Bard. So that's a business opportunity that exists out there. But so let me just move on to the next slide, which I think is yeah. Abhishek, you want to take this?
I will just add, I will, it's kind of wrapping up of the entire presentation. Not the last word, but one of the few last words. Is that how India can move forward? There is no concrete policy as of now. So basically, the government needs to signal that they have to get into the AI race. It is assuming not only the geopolitical dimensions, but it is very critical for our civilizational heritage. I would again borrow from Dr. Rajiv Malhotra's books, his ideas on AI, Five Battlegrounds and AI, where he has very clearly mentioned as to how the Indic civilization is being usurped not only by the West, but by Europe and passing as their own. So likewise, if we are able to create our own data moats, because structured data is what is going to be the moat for the country going forward. So if we are able to have our own data moats, have some interesting startups like which we mentioned in the in the article is also mentioned here in the slides. So, but my own takeaway is that the government should basically, sound a wolf whistle. That it is intent on getting into the AI part. It is intent on using it in the not only the administrative but in the financial legal domains. And then it is also going to align some public money like performance linked incentives for manufacturing. So they should do something similar for the AI and create thousands and thousands of startups. Who knows? We may be able to get something better, just like they have done for the space agencies now. They have captured the market by launching the uh, cheapest satellites as well as the Mangalyaan, and the third Chandrayaan is also on the way. I mean, the possibilities are immense. It's just that the government has to get its act together, basically on the AI being used in the day-to-day life, and not only generative, maybe some other forms of AI. That is one way. So, if you have anything else to add,
Yeah, let me just move to the final slide. Okay. Now, you have painted the positive picture, which says that if only we get our act together, we may, in fact, end up kind of leading the fray, because we have seen this in action with UPI and digitization and digital payments and so forth. I mean, India is literally leading the world in digital payments. Okay, this is something that we would not have anticipated a few years ago. So here we have another opportunity, and at the same time, there is a threat. There are all kinds of people who are attempting to destroy India from many perspectives. On the one hand, you could say that there are malign forces that do not want India to be another manufacturing power or military power. And the fact that China has already come up, okay, you don't want another China. And by the way, China doesn't want India to come up because China wants to dominate India. So, dominate Asia. So there are many things that are they're conspiring against India. And see, this is one more area where we do have the opportunity to not snatch defeat from the jaws of victory, because we do have some remarkable content, civilizational content, as you mentioned. And if we can get that going by putting a concentrated effort, we could leapfrog. And I'm confident that we are at a point where, as a culture and a civilization and a nation, we can do these things. I wouldn't have said this 25 years ago because there were no examples of where we have, been able to reach the pole position. But hey, I think this is India's time, and among all the other good things that are happening, PLIs as you mentioned, and infrastructure and so forth, I think this is something that cannot be ignored, and that no moat business is in fact a godsend for us. And if we can just utilize that and put in, some kind, they call it, it's like a Manhattan project. The Americans have this Manhattan project
yes,
to create,
yes,
a nuclear bomb, right? So we got to do that. Something that is very focused, and and you put all your efforts behind it, and you may fail. It's okay. You gave it your best shot. So that's what I would suggest. We can't be complacent. We are a complacent nation in general. It's like, nothing will happen. But no, things are moving at internet speeds now. Okay, and we just cannot afford to be uh, sitting idly by. So, with that, I think I'd like to conclude because we have reached 44 minutes. So, any final thoughts, Abhishek, or otherwise we'll
yeah.
just.
I would just in the next two slides, if you can move on, just show that how the limitations of the current generative AI exist. So, if you look at it closely, we had asked to summarize the article by using BART first, and it created extremely nonsensical thing. I have highlighted the prompt that I had used, and basically I've just taken a screenshot of its recommendations, and it was very generic. It was not even specific. So this generic thing is like it you could have given to anyone. The next slide shows the chat GPT where I had put in the same prompt, and it was very clear that chat GPT does not have the updated index. So I think the last mentioned update was for last year, and they haven't updated the databases yet, which is a very obvious flaw. So please don't rely on whatever ChatGPT points out. You could probably use it as a parlor trick to show it off to your friends that you are very tech oriented, and some of the kids are misusing it for creating homework, but use your common sense and critical reasoning. That is what humans have and computers lack.
Well said. This is really a toy at the end of the day. It's a nice, entertaining toy. And one more thing I wanted to add to what you said about its summary of our article. It manufactured several things that we didn't say,
Yes.
which is really
Yes.
kind of scary. Okay, we didn't say that, and it's a sort of a generic summary. It could have been a summary of any article on AI, not our article. But the
Absolutely.
fact that it manufactured things, that is scary. Okay, so with that, I think I'd like to bring this to a close. And thank you, Abhishek, for not only appearing here and putting this presentation together, but also all the efforts that both you and I put together in writing this article. It's actually a pleasure putting it together because it's new stuff, and I think we're coming at it from a rather different angle than many other commentators would have. So I encourage people to go off and read that article in full. So thank you once again, and thank you folks
Okay.
for listening. And goodbye, and we'll be back again with another video soon. Thank you.
Thank
Namaskar.
you.
Bye bye.